Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel session. My name is Ana Maria Soto. I'm the Director of Impact and Innovation at Issara Institute, and I am very happy to be here today as a model. I will be moderating this panel session, this great session that is entitled Are We Listening? The Unheard Perspectives Along the Supply Chain. Uh, so why are we having this panel? As Asia continues to be the engine of global productions, its supply chains are facing unprecedented scrutiny. The challenges are complex, from increasing regulatory demands and forced labor risks to shifting geopolitical alliances that force rapid and often unequal commercial arrangements. For too long, the approach to human rights due diligence has been a top-down process, imposing standards on supply chain businesses without their active participation. This has created an environment of audit fatigue, leaving us with a superficial understanding of the real issues and failing to protect the very workers we aim to serve. So today we're here to talk about a different path. We believe that systemic human rights risk can only be solved through equitable, co-invested partnership between brands and suppliers. We will talk about how shifting from transactional compliance for long-term engagement can create meaningful impact. And our panel will also share practical solutions and case studies focused on how we can build relationships that prioritize workers' rights and create a positive, lasting change. So we invite you to listen and also participate in this panel session. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Arit Kapoor is the founder and executive director of Embode, an independent consultancy focusing on business and human rights and social protections. Since setting up Embode in 2015, Arit has overseen the growth and strengthening of the strong global client portfolio globally and across multiple sectors, consisting of FMCG, agriculture, apparel, electronics, energy, and media. Um, Arit, Arit has also spearheaded the Ganapati initiative in both supplier-focused capacity building program across Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia. I'm here also with Laurie Stam. She is the Senior Director of Supplier Assessment and Improvement Programs, where she oversees Verité's global on-site supplier assessment and improvement programs. This program aims to identifying, addressing, and preventing migrant labor, forced labor, and other violations of workers' humans and labor rights in large supply chain and multinational corporations. Before joining Verité, Laurie has over 10 years of experience in the digital workers' voice space and business and human rights advising. And finally, my colleague Mark Taylor, who is the Senior Director of Strategy and Global Partnership at the Issara Institute. Mark has lived and worked in Southeast Asia for over 20 years. He oversees Issara's Strategic Partners Program with global brands, retailers, and importers, and is shaping the direction of Issara Business and Human Rights, HRDD, and ethical recruitment work. Mark has also held positions working in corporate social responsibility and private sectors development initiative for Amazon, the World Bank, and advisor of the Australian government, and managing partners and emerging markets consulting. Mark holds an MBA from Georgetown University. So to kick off our session today, we would like to ask all the audience. We will be having an exercise where you have to scan a QR code that we'll be showing in a minute in the screen. And we would like you to respond to these questions. Who are we not listening to along the supply chain? Are we already seeing some answers? Can we show them on the screen? Great. So let's see. So we are who are we not listening to along the supply chain? So we have affected communities, right holders, workers, indigenous people, children, workers, consumers, businesses and workers, marginalized group, smallholders, consumers. So we're seeing a group of right holders, but also businesses. Let's see what are responses we get. Right, so yeah, we have 18 responses for workers, migrant labor, 8 responses, communities as well, 8 responses, and we also have smallholders. Do you have any new responses? Okay, so home workers, recruitment agents, workers' families. Right. So thanks everyone for sharing your answers. Today, I think we will be touching a lot of all the points that were mentioned. So we saw workers, communities, as well as smaller businesses, small investors as well. So we'll be discussing more about that. So maybe I can start with you, Arid. If you can share how can buyer-suppliers relationships incentivize improving human rights standards and practices?
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. I just want to put up a presentation. So just a little bit about Embode, who I'm representing and speaking from today. Here we are. So one of the things that we're finding from our experience, and I'll just talk about that in a moment, but a little bit about Embode. We are a small business and human rights consulting agency. We work globally, and our clients are across sectors. Our collaborators are across sectors. And in our work over the last 10 years, we've been speaking to all the different kinds of stakeholders that have been mentioned on the Mentimeter. And we're finding that one particular area of stakeholders, we're finding it really, really difficult to get them to come out and speak in public places, to be seen. And they weren't directly mentioned on the screen. And I wonder if anybody knows who I'm talking about, which particular stakeholder group I'm talking about. Government, that's a really good one. Who said that? Yeah, that's a really good one. We're not hearing, perhaps some people would say we're hearing from government when they pass legislation. Is there any other stakeholder group that we haven't mentioned that wasn't on the screen? Right. Okay. Great. I'd love to know who's in the room. So I might ask that question in a moment. But just a little bit about Embode. Here we are. We're based in Southeast Asia, and we work globally. We focus on specific areas of human rights. That includes labor, social protection, anything regarding exploitation. As I mentioned, we have a team around the world, and we're made up of lawyers, workers, social workers, trainers, and teachers. Most of our background is from the social sector and NGOs. I don't think this clicker is working unless on some of our clients. So they include UN, NGOs, as well as multinational businesses. And what do we understand about the one stakeholder that wasn't specifically mentioned in the room today? Supply chain businesses. Could I just ask in the room anyone that's representing a supply chain business, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? Anybody in the room? Thank you, Rachel. So, supply chain business is like tier one manufacturing, processing plants, and this is something that the three of us panelists have been talking about, because when we're working in business and human rights and we're wanting to ensure protection of workers and rights holders, probably who is the most important stakeholder in the supply chain that has the power to influence the lives, the well-being, the protection of rights holders? You know, if we think about the workers, the communities, who's really going to impact their lives? In our view, and what we're finding in Embode, is it's the businesses themselves that are in the role of employer, or owners or managers of a business. And we often don't, especially in forums like this, we don't call suppliers employers. We call them supplier because that is the term used by multinational corporations, because that's their relationship to this business, as they are a supplier. But actually, if you look at it from another perspective, they're an employer. They are a local business owner. And they have impact on the lives of others. They are managers, they are supervisors, they are the recruiters. And when we look at it through that lens, we can see the power that they hold. But yet, in forums like this, we find it really difficult to invite them to come and sit next to us and actually say their point of view. And I think that's really, really interesting. So we actually did a consultation at Embode. We also represent AIM Progress in the APAC region, and we were commissioned to talk to supply chain businesses. We focused initially on India and Indonesia, and then we also invited supply chain businesses from Thailand and Malaysia. And it was a really general interview. We just wanted to hear about what they thought about human rights due diligence and sustainability. We approached over 100, we approached 125 supply chain businesses. Can you guess how many actually said yes to an interview? Who thinks over 50%? Who thinks over 25%? Yeah, we had 22 out of 125. And they were just so reluctant to even give us a confidential, anonymous 1.5 hour interview. If you want to see the report, it's available on AIM Progress's website and our website. And we've filled it with quotes. But it was just so difficult to engage them at anything above a direct, confidential kind of capacity building approach. When we did speak to the 22 businesses across 3 countries in the end, including Thailand, India, and Indonesia, these are just some of the top findings. They said that initially audits helped, even though it was overwhelming, incredibly stressful to start being audited. And after a while, they found that it was just too much to just carry on. They have to have resources specifically just to do audits and comply, even where some of the audit areas were not as relevant for their sector or their country. They felt that some of the audit requirements were outside of, it's the last slide. We're still on the first key findings, that one, that's right. So they talked about how some of the audit requirements were not as relevant for their context, and they even suggested some areas where audits would be more useful for businesses like theirs. They also felt that audits and social compliance was really kind of compliance heavy. They treated it as such. They didn't really understand the sustainability part of why they had to do these audits. And they felt that there was a contradiction between asking them to do audits, buyers asking them to do audits on the one hand, which cost more money, needed more resources. And on the other hand, some buyers, not all, this is what they said, still didn't favor them when it came to purchasing decisions. And that couple of buyers still engaged in the auction, the lowest bidding kind of auction model. And they just felt that that was contradictory. On the one hand, they needed these high standards, especially on labor and their staff and their workers. And on the other hand, they felt that it didn't get them more business at the end of the day. And adverse purchasing practices, I won't go into detail. One of them was a couple of the supply chain businesses were incredibly frustrated, especially the medium-sized enterprises, because obviously suppliers aren't all, you know, a monolith, right? They're small, family-owned, they're really big, sometimes they're bigger than their buyers, right? But some of them that were wanting to grow in their countries were building a new manufacturing plant, a new factory. They were very proud of what they had built, and they were very proud to have big brands as their buyers. And yet, you know, they didn't understand why after delivery, payment could take up to 180 days. And this meant cash flow issues. And yet they're trying to keep these workers, and they had labor issues that weren't really understood. So I'll go to the next slide. I don't want to take up too much time. So here are some of the key recommendations that came out. They said it would be really good to understand us as our profiles. Are we medium-sized? Are we large? Are we family-owned? And in different countries, such as India and Indonesia, there are also different statuses of businesses. There's lots of different ways of registering a business. So what is their profile? They asked if sustainability departments and procurement departments could speak the same language. Can we not have different messages from procurement and sustainability? They loved it when they were engaged in meaningful dialogue. They didn't feel they were really invited for meaningful dialogue. These are just the people that we spoke to, of course. They felt that a transactional approach is relationships are better than a transactional approach. And they would like their buyers to understand their labor challenges. It's already enough that minimum wages are improving and increasing at national and regional levels across most of Asia, which is fantastic. And that's something that employers have to keep up with. You can get more from the report. I'll move on to the next. So how are we working at Embode? How are we working with suppliers? Well, we've launched the Ganapati initiative, where we work across these 5 countries. We'll hopefully be expanding to more, where we work directly with suppliers, one-on-one, in a safe space, where we are able to talk to them, listen to their issues, and hold their hands, working through improving their recruitment and labor standards. So Ganapati is the term for the mythical deity Ganesha, who is revered across Southeast Asia. And that's why we named it as such. And as I mentioned, we work with them confidentially, consultatively, and collaboratively. So if you'd like more details about that, you can have a look at our website. But I'll stop there just to really name that anytime we as Embode invite supply chain businesses to come and speak on a panel, to come and be seen, they do not want to be seen. I think part of it, in my experience, is they're being called to play a game where the rules were made up without their consultation. And so when they enter the game, they're already losing. And they're being blamed, but yet there's such an integral part of business and human rights, the well-being of workers and rights holders. And so I think that's something really to see, their absence in the room. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for your remarks. Sorry, 1 minute. So it's very interesting and important points that you mentioned of like what are the key findings as well as the recommendations. If maybe I can transition now like to Lori, if you can share a little bit more of like what is like the day-to-day life for the suppliers, sure. Right? So how can human rights be embedded as part of like that day-to-day operations in and supply chains?
Thank you. I'll just briefly introduce Verité, who I represent here today. It's a nonprofit with over 30 years of experience. We have over 400 business partners, and we work in 97 countries around the world. And our focus issues are forced labor, child labor, migrant labor, working conditions in general. And our vision is a world where people work under safe, fair, and legal conditions. Moving to the next slide. So today I want to talk a little bit about some practical pathways for embedding human rights into business practices, and especially talking about the challenges that suppliers or direct employers face. We can move to the next. So maybe to paint the picture, I'm going to talk a little bit about, Artie and I were talking about overtime hours, for example. So I'm going to just give the case of, let's say, two suppliers in Southeast Asia. They're approached separately by the same client to fulfill, let's say, some apparel orders. So first time that they've been approached by this client, they're really excited because they're opening up their market, and the client says, but in order for us to purchase from you, you must be compliant with our code of conduct. And one of the part of our code of conduct says that you cannot allow workers to work more than 60 hours per week, according to ILO standards. There's no dialogue, there's no informing of why that is, just that they must be compliant. So in this region, one of the comparative advantages and why there is so much production is because labor is relatively cheap compared to other parts of the world. And what workers have done to compensate for the fact that minimum wage is fairly low is they work a lot of overtime hours to make up for the fact that minimum wage is not enough to live by. And in countries where you have 48 hours a week of working time, 60 hours really is only 12 additional overtime hours, which doesn't give you much. So a lot of the local labor laws, you can work up to 36 overtime hours in a week. And with that, workers, yes, are working a lot of hours. They're tired, but they're bringing home enough money, perhaps, to cover their cost of living. So supplier A and supplier B look at what they have to do to be able to be compliant with this code of conduct. Supplier B says, it's impossible, I won't be able to do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hide my overtime hours in a double booking system, and I'm going to show some falsified documentation if I ever get an audit, and I'm just going to continue business as usual, and nothing really changes. Supplier A is really excited about the prospect of being able to sell to these bigger brands, and decides they're going to become compliant. And then what happens is that the workers are upset that their hours are being cut. And suddenly they're going across the road to supplier B. And now supplier A is actually facing a very large turnover rate. And they actually have to continue to keep hiring. And in order to hire workers, they actually now are going outside of their country, and they're bringing in migrant labor. And they have no previous experience with migrant labor, and they don't even know what they're getting themselves into. And suddenly they've opened up a door to forced labor conditions without even knowing what they're getting themselves into in the first place. And so the very idea of human rights, due diligence coming from the corporate level, thinking that they're going to protect workers' rights by implementing a code of conduct of no more than 60 hours, is actually now opening the door to more human rights violations. And that is why it's so complex, that you cannot just have a top-down human rights strategy if you really want to protect workers' rights. So moving to the next slide, I'm going to talk about 3 practical pathways to confront some of this complexity. One of them is fair purchasing and business practices. The next is capacity building and shared learning. And the next is worker voice and human rights. We only have a very short time here, so I'm trying to go through as quickly as possible. And I'm definitely open for conversation after the fact. But moving to the next slide, talking about fair purchasing and business practices, what suppliers had said to Embode that procurement and sustainability aren't talking to each other. It's still true. For most large multinationals, it's incredibly separate. And so procurement doesn't even necessarily know what sustainability and human rights is doing in the same company. And there's no incentive for compliance a lot of the times. So having fair pricing, stable orders, and reasonable lead times can reduce the pressure that drives some of these labor or environmental abuses. And a practical solution that, going to the next slide, that Verité offers, which is open source, completely free, and available directly to suppliers or employers, is the recruitment cost calculator. So this supplier A, who has now decided to bring in migrant labor, could go to this recruitment cost calculator and say, I'm recruiting migrants from this country into this country, and we have done all the research to know what is a low end and what is a high end cost of recruitment, a real cost of recruitment, after speaking to thousands of workers over 30 years, what they've paid, and seeing what the actual cost of recruitment is, so that they know when they are making the agreements with the recruitment agencies exactly what they should be paying. And so with this, moving to the next slide, you can actually build that cost into negotiations with the client, with the brand, saying, okay, if you want me to have an employer pays policy that protects workers from paying recruitment costs, this is what it actually costs. And maybe you could actually pay that cost up front with your orders, so that we aren't having to pay workers back for millions of dollars in remediation down the road because we haven't proactively paid for those recruitment costs. So it's a tool that is available on our website. There's a QR code at the end of my presentation if you'd like more information. And then the next thing that is important is talking about capacity building and shared learning. So the conversation with procurement should also open up the doors to being able to understand where are the gaps in understanding. How do you integrate some of these compliance areas, some of these human rights areas into management systems to promote workers' rights and protections? And the idea is that we can go to the next if you want to. With Verité, we can assist in that progression, from being on the ground to identifying the gaps, and doing, not only does the onus only fall on the suppliers, but also talking about what are the procurement practices and the relationship between the brands and the suppliers that are sometimes causing these complex human rights issues. And so Verité has been working around the world in these improvement programs. So it's not a punitive action. What it is a collaboration for continuous improvement. And this is how brands and suppliers can work together to tackle some of these issues, rather than these checklist audits where you're either compliant or you're not, and then you get punished by losing orders if you're not compliant. Moving to the next. And the other area that is key is hearing directly from the workers. So it's very important that suppliers understand that a suggestion box is not sufficient to hear from workers, that to have an accessible grievance mechanism is quite complex. Are you taking into consideration all of the different languages? Are you taking into consideration their level of literacy? Are you taking into consideration the cultural barriers to being able to speak directly, if you're a woman, a migrant woman, to a male supervisor from another country? There are so many levels to thinking about an effective communication channel for workers. So this is another area that Verité has worked a lot in, and is key to understanding what's actually happening on the ground, and for suppliers themselves to understand where are their gaps in their own systems. So this, used properly, can help lead to an ongoing improvement and feedback loop in making sure that workers are respected. There's a lot I was trying to cram into 10 minutes, and I'm happy to speak about any of the topics more. I'm very passionate about the work that I do, and yeah, I'm happy to connect with anybody about any of these topics at a later time. I'll hand it off.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurie, for sharing more about what is that day-to-day operations like? What are the challenges faced by the suppliers as well as the gaps and understanding what can be done? With that, I would like to transition now to you, Mark. If you can share how can we reduce audit burden and create a space for partnership with neutral third parties?
Great. Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for joining us in the room and online. So I'm with the Issara Institute. Issara means freedom in many Southeast Asian languages. We're primarily working in Southeast Asia and South Asia, but we're scaling and expanding. We're a nonprofit organization. We started in 2014, so we're about 11 years old. And really, worker voice has underpinned the work that we do since our inception. So currently, we're running one of the largest independent worker voice mechanisms in the region. We're receiving around 15 to 20,000 calls and messages from workers per month. And that's, a big part of that is Issara's own different channels and how we're hearing from workers, but it also represents a network that we've been building out. So this network includes values-aligned civil society organizations, grassroots organizations, local trade unions from Myanmar, from Thailand, from Cambodia, from Nepal, Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan. We're also working with recruitment agencies and buyers to help remediation and to build stronger systems. So essentially, we're on the ground working in supply chains, trying to build better working conditions, strengthening grievance mechanisms, directly engaging in remediation, enabling responsible recruitment, and then having the tools, technology, and different programs to support eliminating those risks, but also building stronger systems. We go to the next slide, please. And ultimately, we view that we can do this through worker voice, partnership, and innovation. So just very briefly, to give a sense of some of the different partners that we're working with and donors. On the left-hand side, you see some logos of businesses that brands and retailers and importers as well that have been, really embracing, the opportunities that can come with worker voice in a collaborative way. On the right-hand side, some of the civil society organizations that also are using what we call inclusive labor monitoring, the ILM system, essentially a case-based backbone for the ongoing feedback from workers and how that information gets actioned and analyzed. In addition to this, what we didn't show up here in different logos is, the hundreds of different suppliers, the employers themselves, as well as recruitment agencies across the region. But that sort of brings us to, the main topic here, and what we're really focusing on is, what are we hearing on the ground, sort of about the everyday realities, the business decision making, and what is and is not being discussed or really listened to. And the focus is one, we're looking at, well, what's happening? What are we hearing directly from suppliers, sort of to keep some of the main theme going? But I also want to bring in recruitment agencies and workers as well into the picture. There's been a lot discussed. There's a lot of literature, a lot of discourse around some of the challenges that come with audits, the audit burdens that suppliers, are facing, the fatigue, some of the challenges with not really capturing, when you have a point in time assessment, what's happening over a longer period. But I don't want to focus on that so much. What I want to focus on is on another aspect that gets a little bit less discussed when you have a scenario, a system that's very audit compliant driven. And that means, what is that sort of pushing out or crowding out when you don't have opportunities, or suppliers, employers themselves don't have the bandwidth to go ahead and take on other kind of collaborative initiatives, some of those which, we're hearing today. And that poses a real challenge, not only for business, but for civil society, who typically can be on the ground and very strong partners in supporting some of these different positive outcomes, but also for global buyers and others whose policies and standards and aspirations they want to see within their own supply chain from a social perspective. And so when you don't have that space, to sort of let in or to embrace some of those other opportunities, it's also not addressing some of the key things we're hearing from suppliers themselves. And that is, not recognizing, as we heard today, a lot of the efforts and the improvements that these individual businesses are taking to try to build out and strengthen their own internal systems. And so when we're having conversations, with different businesses, with these suppliers, they want a level playing field. They want to make sure that the requirements that are often coming, is that, they're being applied equally across, their peers, across their competitors. They're asking, they feel proud, obviously, of the different policies and initiatives that they have conducted in-house. They want those to be recognized, as well as their own investments and the improvements that they're taking on. And so, I think it was well said here earlier that when you have typically human rights and social responsibility teams that are having a higher standard than what's at national levels, and a business is working hard to either try to improve their own policies or to go ahead and meet what some of those requirements are, when it comes down to the actual negotiations with the commercial teams and where priorities get placed, whether that's through the supplier scorecards or just incentives, it's not being recognized. So I think that's one of the things that we hear quite often. But what we wanted to show on this slide here is that, there's a real potential to address that when you have ongoing worker voice and that feedback that's able to develop and yield, ongoing high quality information. And so it has to be high quality in the sense that the information that's being provided is trusted by the different parties. We want to make sure that, as the information comes in, it's not being just collected, for due diligence purposes, or just, through surveys. It's actually leading to, real change and real impact. And this is where I think a lot of the missed opportunity comes in, is that you have an ability with this ongoing feedback to see what is working, what those different investments that the business is taking, is that actually generating and developing into the kind of outcomes that were anticipated. And so through worker voice, for the way that Issara is operating in this network of civil society organizations, we can go ahead and monitor and measure the actual impact that it's having. So one of the ways that we're looking at impact, it's not just through reach metrics. It's not just how many polls or how many workers have replied, but is actually resulting in real change. And so that number down at the bottom right, that over 250,000 workers were receiving remediation in the last 2 years through the system. Yes, it's in part because of the NGOs and civil society organizations that are enabling this sort of system to take place, but it's also because workers feel strong enough to stand up, to go ahead and share this feedback, and the suppliers themselves are acting upon it. And if you have a business that's actually driving remediation, we can be looking at what the quality of that remediation, how long it took to go ahead and address it. Are issues repeating, or is there backsliding? And these kind of developments and that kind of data can really help, I think, hopefully, carve out more space for suppliers to be able to say, hey, I have the internal systems, I have the data to support that, and it's coming because it's worker validated, and it's coming through these different independent channels. Slide. Responsible recruitment is another area that we hear a lot in. We've developed a lot of different tools to address the kind of feedback and challenges, both from not only from job seekers and workers, but also from recruitment agencies themselves and suppliers. One of the big areas that comes up and that doesn't get discussed as much, but certainly hits upon the theme, I think, that's coming out around responsible, purchasing and procurement practices, is the knock-on effects that has when a supplier is receiving payment that comes, net 90, net 180 sometimes, from their customers, the impact that actually has on the recruitment agencies themselves. And so we're seeing that many times recruitment agencies, these are typically SMEs, especially if we're talking about, sending workers from foreign countries, they typically don't have a lot of free cash flow. And so the reality is, if they don't have the cash flow and they're getting paid very late for placing workers, they have to find another source. And so many times that's coming from workers themselves. And we've seen very progressive recruitment agencies that have good policies, but because of the terms of payment that are coming from their customers, they're actually having to go to workers to go ahead and get money. And then basically it undermines the whole employer pays or just having legal recruitment process. So we've developed different tools. Golden Dreams Marketplace is one, a revolving fund. I'm happy to share more information about this, but basically can help suppliers and help job seekers have better tools down to the first mile in origin countries to push out brokers, to have more informed recruitment practices. If we go to the next slide. One other thing, just very briefly to mention, that's through the formal recruitment channels. We've seen a lot in the region of basically these formal government to government channels being stalled. And so what is happening is you have a lot of what we call walk-in workers, workers that are already in the country are looking to go ahead and shift employers. In the case of Myanmar, perhaps fleeing, forced conscription and just what's happening there. And what we want to highlight that, part of the value of having this feedback directly from civil society is that we can see a lot of the different challenges and fees and risks that are accruing because you can have that kind of feedback and because things are dynamic, they're changing all the time. So what you're seeing in the pink color here is walk-in workers. This is filtered just from Thailand. We've been running these different analyses and surveys. Over 3,788 workers were surveyed, but the ones in pink are just from Thailand, from walk-in workers. And you can see fees, especially on the x-axis there, which is month, just in the last 2 years, of over $1,000, almost up to $2,000 that workers are paying for a job. So people may think that, if workers are already in country, a lot of that recruitment risk is being addressed. But the reality is these are challenges that employers are facing, and they need more clear guidance, or there needs to be more discussion about the realities of what they're seeing for labor and employment on the ground and how things can change very quickly. Next slide. So I think maybe the last slide just to highlight is that another thing we're hearing from a lot of suppliers themselves is that, with more and more technology, there's more pressures and requirements coming down for an employer to adopt a tool. And there's a lot of shiny objects out there. There's a lot of different tools. We've talked a little bit on this panel already about sort of polling, but also the value of hearing directly from workers themselves and for workers to be able to share things that are of importance to them that they want to raise, not necessarily sort of confined within a certain set of requirements. And so with that, then, if you're able to have tools that support employers so they can have the feedback that they need about different issues that they're hearing from workers. And this is capturing, if you go to workervoices.org, www.workervoices.org, we've basically put out as a public good aggregated anonymized data that's not only coming from Issara, but also from other civil society organizations and analyzed it across a number of different ways. But we want to provide suppliers with tools so that they can have more ownership. We talk about worker voice. We want to have a little bit more, honestly, of supplier voice to be able to push back and say, I shouldn't be required just to have one tool. Just like all of us, we have many tools on our apps, by apps, or just in the ways we engage for different topics. Employers should have those as well. But you need to go ahead and see that they're actually having impact. Businesses, buyers need to have the assurances that those are driving real change. And so one of the things we're really trying to, open up opportunities by suppliers having their own logins and dashboards and systems, buyers, civil society, all connected within this ILM environment, is the ability to be able to monitor, to be able to demonstrate impact and what's working and what's needs to be strengthened through data that's coming from workers, and hopefully that's empowering suppliers in the process. I think I'm about at time, so I'll go ahead and stop there. But one last point is just that it can be directly linked to human rights due diligence, CSDDD reporting. When you have these systems in place, you are already going ahead and meeting, as you see on the bottom in yellow, the core steps that come across for HRDD from the ground up. And that can be enabled through systems like this, through partnerships with organizations on the ground.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for the remarks. So before we go to the Q&A, I would like to ask the panelists if you have any final remarks.
Maybe just to say that in the context of what is happening around the globe today and how uncertain times are, I think the only way forward is through collaboration and partnerships on all levels. And so looking for ways to collaborate is really going to be the only way to navigate the stormy seas that are coming up, that it involve the tariffs and the supply chain disruptions and the unstable country conditions. And I think that thinking about new ways and innovative ways to share some of the burden of HRDD is really the next step for moving forward in this global context.
No, I'd love to hear some juicy questions and comments.
Great. So we'd like to now invite the audience, online and also in person, if you have any questions for our panelists
Or comments as well.
or comments. All right. So I see some hands up. So maybe we can start on that table. I think you might have a mic on your table.
Yes, please use the
Speak-
mics on the
speak-
table so
speak
that
to-
our online participants can hear.
Also, if you can like briefly introduce yourself and if you have the question for any specific panelist or if it's open to any. Yeah, thank you.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you. My name is Alia from Indonesia. I'm from an organization called The New Factory. We are a worker cooperative working in the textile recycling space in the country. And from our experience, but also from what I'm hearing from all the panelists today, is that the unfortunate fact is that multinational corporations who are buyers is sort of externalizing the costs of improving human rights standards in the day-to-day business operations to suppliers, which is sad and a non-starter because suppliers face resource constraint. They often don't even know what to do themselves, and they're not even given the guarantee that investing in certain areas are going to make them to remain competitive business-wise, right? But in your experience speaking to or even working with the MNC that are the buyers here, what is their general response to like recommendations that will cause increase of costs in their side? For example, like things like co-investments or like just paying more for procurement, things like that. What are the general response to recommendations like that? Because I think without that happening, this issue will continue to be stuck where we are right now, right? Yeah, that's my question.
I can comment just briefly. Should we take a few questions maybe, or?
Sure, maybe we can take. So I think that there was one in the back. Oh, will you? Yes, please. And if you do, you mind like using the mic so the online audience can also hear?
Hello, yes, my name is Alex Kaufman. I'm an independent consultant and trainer and recovering social compliance auditor. I was interested how you introduce these initiatives into the factory via management.
Hey, thank you. And I think we can take one more and then we can go to.
Hi, I'm now in a consultant with the Consumer Goods Forum, also with an unfortunate social compliance audit background. So my question is really, RT, you were talking about the need to sort of contextualize and make audits relevant and localized. And obviously, Mark, you were talking about the need to supplement with worker voice, inclusive monitoring, grievance, etc. But those outcomes are also somewhat opposed to a lot of the goals of brands, which is standardization and economies of scale. And so how do you have those conversations, with some of your own clients who say, no, I want everything to be standardized, uniform, one number, score out of 10, etc., to make them align on, having shared goals and expectations?
Great, thank you. I think we can go now too. All right, would you like to go first?
All right, great. Yeah, brilliant questions. Maybe I'll start with Nawin's first, just because it's so the response to how do you have a more tailored, contextualized approach with suppliers or supply chain businesses when brands generally prefer standardized? The thing is that if it's all standardized, it's not a one size fits all doesn't actually fit all. I don't know if any of you have been around Bangkok the last couple of days. Maybe some of you are visitors. But one thing that's really common I find here is I go to a market and it's just one size blouse or a one size shirt or a skirt. And it kind of looks nice on the hanger, but it's either, too big for me, too baggy. It doesn't always fit and I don't end up wearing it. So One size doesn't fit all. I think the answer would be, Noen, principles. Principles of, if we want to call it human rights, but in a language that supply chain businesses understand, it would be principles of safe labor, principles of worker well-being. What are these principles? And that's how it would be, rather than a tick box. So that's what I would say as a short answer to that. And with Ganapati, we work with principles. There's no set checklist. And then I think the first question was around the response. I'm just going to go to the first question, the response to the call for co-investment. How are we seeing buyers and brands responding to that? I think that's a really, really important internal conversation that some of the biggest companies and buyers need to have, because there's lots of different views even within a multinational corporation. If you speak to sustainability, they might have a different view to the finance or the legal or the procurement teams, and I think that we're looking at a model where the rules of international trade, how we can't forget the historical, political, social, cultural context of globalization. Globalization has come about on hundreds of years of history. And it means that supply chains seem to have flourished because of the inherent externalization of social costs, right? I mean, why are goods cheaper from some countries and why are they more expensive from some countries? It's because people don't have access to healthcare, people don't have access to social security. So coming back to your question about response to co-investment, I think that different companies have different responses. Some are a lot more evolved and are looking at paying more for better standards. And we have some examples of that. Certification is the old model, paying premiums for a standard. But I think there's more. I think later today, Consumer Goods Forum, led by Woolworths Group, is looking at ethical marketplace using an economic lens. I would really suggest everybody come to that one, where we'll probably be looking at that kind of question. And then how to introduce these kinds of initiatives through management. You have to get their buyers buy-in, and it's introduced through their buyers. So with us and Ganapati, our clients are brands, and they sell Ganapati as an approach to their suppliers at no initial cost to suppliers. And they say, you will get business consultancy the same way we get business consultancy. Basically, Embode will consult to you directly, confidentially, and you can share your problems with them, and they won't share your problems with us unless, apart from these. So it's really a win-win kind of situation, and it's completely voluntary based.
Thanks, Artie. Yeah, I won't add too much on, except for that I have from Verité, we've seen many MNCs have really innovative approaches to the shared responsibility that the UN Guiding Principles talks about, that it should be shared. It shouldn't all fall onto one single player. We've seen upfront investments in recruitment costs, so basically paying a premium at the beginning of a contractual relationship between a buyer and a supplier to cover a year's cost of recruitment, for example, based on the recruitment calculator, for example. Or we've seen funds being put aside for ongoing supplier improvement and training and capacity building programs. There are a lot of new innovative approaches out there, and I think some of the larger multinational companies are starting to see the need to have this shared responsibility approach, and that the way that things have been working aren't really working anymore, because when suddenly you have really bad press and consumer outrage because of of something that's happened in some of your factories that you source from, the outcome and the cost of remediation and trying to recover your reputation, they've started to see that it actually is way more expensive to deal with a crisis when it's already reached a crisis level than to prevent that crisis. So I think there is a lot more awareness, but there still is a disconnect between procurement and sustainability that needs to be addressed in the grand majority of what we have seen so far. And I think talking about management, it's also about raising awareness and raising understanding levels, and also about the industry in itself. You know, if you're asking farmers to comply with international standards, it's an entirely different playing field than talking about a manufacturing sector. And so understanding the challenges of that sector and raising awareness of what can be done within that sector, and sharing the responsibility as much as possible is really key.
Some really good points. So to maybe just try to add on those a little bit, just from our own perspective at Issara, I think for that management buy-in to have that engagement, it's come from different ways. You know, one of the ways that's the more typical way has been through the introductions from buyers, from those brands and retailers, because we are talking oftentimes about, you know, higher standards that require a bit more investment and engagement on the ground. But we've also had situations where leadership, you know, their own values, their own aspirations, you know, have been aligned, that they, you know, this is the vision that they want to go ahead and take the organization. I think in those cases, being able to show alignment or how, you know, this can help support in-house initiatives as well has been quite helpful. We've looked at it from the data perspective also as a management tool. For having greater visibility that supports, you know, the different, whether it's HR operations and that type feedback. But at the moment, yeah, I think it is the buyers that are having a lot more influence in terms of the sort of the immediacy of taking on different initiatives. In terms of the scale question and the standardization, you know, that comes up a lot for us. Certainly, you know, being a nonprofit, you know, operating in this region, and it's one of the reasons why we started this Inclusive Labor Monitoring Action Network, because of that. You know, we saw that there's a lot of great organizations on the ground that maybe not necessarily are plugged into, you know, some of the global buyers, what those customers look like, but certainly have the trust of workers. And so in developing, you know, the platform that we have, a lot of that was built on the need to have more of a common language, the classification of different issues that come in, the infrastructure, to go ahead and have referrals and to have data be kept in a safeguarded way, but still get in front of the right folks that you know need to have visibility. And so this is building and scaling and growing out. So, you know, with collaborations with local trade unions, with other nonprofit organizations that also have, you know, their reach, you know, their tentacles into the communities and the locations where they're operating, you know, is way that we're growing it. But at the end of the day, I think you know, we keep having to ask ourselves, you know, what is the quality of the information that's currently being received versus what you can have, something that may be a little bit more fragmented, but you're looking to bring together. There is a big difference, especially when we look at how dynamic things are. So if you have the ability to start tapping into, you know, all the different changes that are going on to try to prevent issues before they escalate, so we're just not in reactive mode, we can start actually preventing issues a lot more. You know, it's the folks that are on the ground, those that workers are trusting or hearing from, but it's set up in an environment that, yeah, I think just holds a lot more potential for the outcomes that we're all looking for.
Great. Yes, so I think we have some questions that are coming online.
So one of the first questions in the chat box was, is it a problem when a different political parties and governments take over and interfere with different employers? And does it also affect how they operate? And the second question we have is, how do you engage with CSOs and workers' organization on the issues of this decent work in the supply chain?
My answer to the first question on how suppliers are impacted by government. Of course they are, because government regulations, decisions have direct impact on businesses. We're already hearing about the impact on supply chains with the tariffs in some Asian countries. So they have direct impact on costs, and that in fact, if government decisions didn't have an impact on suppliers, you'd wonder why. Government decisions impact everybody. In terms of how we work with CSOs and worker representatives are integral to representing voices and accessing workers and rights holders. They're integral. So we work with them in consultations for rights holders, as well as lots of different partnerships. But I'll let the others speak on that, because you might be representing non-profits as well.
Just really quickly, because I do think we are at time, but yeah, Verité is a civil society organization, and we partner with several others to implement projects and programs around the globe. And we truly believe that partnership and collaboration is the way forward across all sectors. And I agree completely with Artie about government decisions will always affect every aspect of the way that businesses work within supply chains.
I think for us, in terms of how we collaborate, who we collaborate with organizations on the ground, a few things. We are looking at do they have safeguards in place for workers? There's all sorts of organizations who operate in different ways. We're looking at what are the different strengths? We take a strengths-based approach in terms of understanding who are good partners, who are good referrals, and is it driving outcomes, positive outcomes for workers. But in general, I think we've seen that there's just a large number of just fantastic organizations on the ground that we just like to have a seat at the table, or certainly to help be more directly contributing into the global supply chains and the impact of workers. And I think that kind of information, the ability to include them, especially in a day and age where there's just a lot more AI-driven large ESG platforms and so on, that maybe looking at that higher level, we need to look at it from the bottom up, and also to make sure that we're supporting the organizations on the ground, especially as development funds and others are becoming more scarce. And so there's a lot of value, and I think, in support that can come through those local on-the-ground partnerships.
Great. So I think we're on time. Thank you very much for joining us. So all the panelists will be around this week. If you have any questions, you can always approach them. So thanks again for joining this session.